to others of you to our workshop today, Recent Developments and the Way Forward Criminalizing Ecocide. So in the morning session that we just completed, we heard about proposed Spanish ecocide legislation and other relevant developments in Spain. And now we turn to the international level. So we look at environmental crimes accountability at the level of the International Criminal Court. And that involves two main things, really. To hear about the ECOCIDE proposal that has been recently tabled before the ICC, for a large part due to the work of Stop Ecocide Foundation and other civil society groups who have been dedicated to this matter for quite some time. And it also involves an ambition to draft a policy paper at the level of the ICC, of the Office of the ICC Prosecutor. So that's what we will focus on in the afternoon session. So I don't want to steal too much of time. So let me welcome our presenters and expert panelists. So first off in the program is Giorgio Metta next to me, co-founder and CEO of Stop Ecocide International, who will give us a presentation about an independent crime of ecocide. Initial considerations is the title. Giorgio was convener of the independent expert panel for the legal definition of genocide. Ecocide, apologies. Thank you. Very good. And Giorgio and Stop Ecocide has, as you know, played a key role promoting the adoption of ecocide as the fifth ICC crime. So we really look forward to hearing more about that today. Next, we have a presentation by Kevin Heller, who is joining us online from Copenhagen. And he will talk about the development and substance of the ICC, of the Office of the ICC Prosecutor's policy paper on environmental crimes. Kevin is Professor of International Law and Security at the University of Copenhagen and also serves as the Special Advisor on War Crimes to the International Criminal Court Prosecutor, and in that capacity has taken the lead on the development of this policy paper. And then we will have our expert panelists coming in. First, Rodrigo Hierro, who is with us in the room here. Rodrigo was a member of the International Expert Panel for the definition of ecocide, and he is director of Stop Ecocide International for Americas. He's also vice president of Derechos Humanos Sin Fronteras, and Rodrigo has engaged these issues for many years, both in his capacity as an academic and also, of course, in his work for Stop Ecocide. Then we have Daryl Robinson joining us from Canada. So Daryl is Professor of Law at Queen's University, and Daryl has been deeply engaged in debates covering ecocide and other issues about environmental crimes accountability, both at the level of the ICC and also in national jurisdictions. And then we have Karen Hulme and Marina Lestal, both from the University of Essex in the UK. So Karen is a professor of law, and she's the IUCN WCL chair of the Working Group on Environmental Security and Conflict Law. Karen has worked extensively on environmental crimes accountability, and Marina is senior lecturer in the School of Law. She holds an LLM from the University of Cambridge, a PhD from EUI, and a master in animal law and society from the University of Autonoma of Barcelona. In 2017, she was appointed expert in reparations by the ICC in the Almaty case, and she consulted with the Trust Fund for Victims between 2018 and 2020. Her current research focuses on animal rights, rights of nature, and victim reparations. So following that long list of excellent speakers, then we will turn to an open debate towards the end of the session. So we look forward to hearing questions and comments, both from the audience with us here in the room and hopefully also from our audience online. So lastly, I would like to thank the organizations and grants that have helped make this event here today possible. So thanks to the International Council on Environmental Law, ISIL. Thank you to the research project Making Peace with Nature and Making Nature a Key for Peace, also known as Pax Natura, led by our colleague, Professor Montserrat Abad. I also want to say thank you to the university and the different entities within the university that have supported today's event, including the Office of the Rice Rectorate, who has provided financial support. And of course, a thank you to the audiovisual team, including the persons who are with us in the room here today. And of course, from the university side, we also want to extend a warm thank you to Stop ECOCIDE. It's always wonderful to collaborate with you. So thank you, Rodrigo, and thank you, Giorgio, and thank you also to Maite Mompo, who unfortunately cannot be with us here today. So yeah, with that, I will hand over the word to you, Giorgio.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the university and to all of those supporting organisations for having us here. I'm going to talk about the addition of ecocide to the Rome Statute as a fifth crime, and we're at a very important moment in this initiative. And I will focus a little bit on the areas that were focused on at the Assembly of States Parties to the International Criminal Court just nearly about 2 weeks ago during an official side event there. But I will also take a few broader thoughts as well from the perspective of Stop Ecocide International, as we've been at the front line of supporting the growth of this conversation over recent years. So the topic at the International Criminal Court, the topic of ecocide and the possibility of adding ecocide as a fifth crime, is one that has been live for some years. As some of you may know, it was first sort of officially flagged up and called for by the Pacific Island Republic of Vanuatu back in 2019.
People in the internet is not hearing.
Ah, do we have do we have a technical issue? We're just going to see if we. Okay, no, good for you. We'll see if we can sort that out. And yeah, I'm not showing up, I don't think. Hi. Okay, let's see if they can now hear me.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, can they hear me now? Okay. Thank you, and apologies for the technical issue there. So I'm going to have a look at the development of ecocide as a fifth crime at the International Criminal Court, and also talk about some of the points that were raised at the recent Assembly of States Parties at the beginning of this month in an official side event of a similar name to my talk here. In other words, initial considerations when looking at ecocide as a fifth crime. The conversation has been live at the ICC now for several years, since the Republic of Vanuatu introduced the topic back in 2019, calling in their official government statement for member states to seriously consider the inclusion of ecocide into the Rome Statute. This followed initial conversations with Polly Higgins, my dear departed co-founder and barrister, with whom I started what is now Stop Ecocide International. So Vanuatu was the first diplomatic kind of commitment, if you like, was the first state to make a diplomatic commitment to this. And their original joining of the Rome Statute was for environmental reasons back in 2012. So there's a strong logic to them taking this up. What we should note is that the conversation has, as an organisation, we have worked together with and supported the determination, actually, of Vanuatu as they've carried this conversation forward over the years. And we've done that through working with them on official side events at the ICC on a yearly basis. So to begin with, the first side event that we did with them back in 2019 was around the topic of how the International Criminal Court could address environmental crimes. The following year, there was a discussion on that a definition was needed and was being convened. At that time, the panel had just been convened to draw a draft together of a possible international crime. The following year, the side event presented the definition. And the year after that, we looked at the relationship between the ICC's role and the global crisis of climate and ecological emergency. And then last year in New York, we looked at and listened to some of the key voices of the victims of ecocide from different parts of the world. And so you can see there's been a kind of gradual development of that conversation. But the importance this year cannot be overstated, in the sense that, as you heard earlier today in the Spanish section of this event, a proposal has now actually been placed formally on the table in an official capacity by 3 Pacific Ocean states, Vanuatu, Fiji and Samoa. And that was done in September into the Working Group on Amendments, which is the dedicated forum within the Assembly of States Parties that has a mandate to examine proposed amendments to the Rome Statute. But the event that was held this December, on the 3rd of December, at the Assembly of States Parties itself, was, I suppose, it constituted the kind of formal announcement in front of that assembly from those states, with an additional state, supporting state, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the first African state to publicly step up and declare support for this initiative. So they presented in front of the assembly, as did some very key voices addressing issues that the fifth crime of ecocide will need to take into account, or issues that states joining this conversation should be interested to consider. I'll just mention that some of those voices were, for example, Philippe Sands-Casey, who is extremely well renowned internationally for his work with states and working at international tribunals, as well as for his particular expertise on the origins of international crimes. We also had a contribution from the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, who drew a lot of connections between environmental harms and human rights, and this is something that has come up already today in some detail here at this event. We also had, moderating the event was the Deputy Prosecutor, Nazat Shamim Khan. Now, obviously, as a moderator, the personal opinions don't enter so much into that conversation. And of course, as we know, any adoption or change into the Rome Statute is down to the states parties and not to the court structure itself. Nonetheless, this was a very strong internal endorsement of the conversation and a recognition of the importance of the conversation that Deputy Prosecutor Khan was willing and indeed keen to take up this moderator's position within that event. We also had Daryl Robinson present, who you'll be hearing from later today. And we had Margareta Wawrinka-Singh, who's worked closely with Vanuatu and other states on the International Court of Justice advisory opinion on climate change and state responsibilities in that context. And we also had an incredible voice who's co-lead of our Youth for Ecocide Law network, Debbie Buyaki from Kenya, who also presented the perspective of youth. So that gives you a kind of a sense of the different areas that were presented in terms of initial considerations around the inclusion of ecocide as a fifth crime. And I think that what we can say is that as a result of that building up of that conversation over many years, and now the actual proposal of an amendment, which, as again was mentioned earlier, has actually used the independent expert panel's definition of ecocide to put that forward. The presentation of that to the Assembly, I firmly believe, will be looked back on as a historic moment, because I firmly believe, as indeed Philippe Sands very clearly stated in that event as well, that the addition of ecocide to the Rome Statute is not in question. It's purely an issue of how long it's going to take. And one of the things that I would like to bring in at this point, from the perspective of us as an organisation, where we've been engaging with many, many different sectors of society, and we work at two levels really, at diplomatic and political level, in sort of an advisory capacity, but also very much in terms of the public narrative. We have many collaborative and cross-feeding conversations with many, many different sectors. And what we can say is that when we started this work, we aimed specifically for the International Criminal Court in the belief that, of course, there's a kind of a coherence that comes into play with an international crime. Any country ratifying an international crime is likely to include that in some way in its own penal code, in a way that reflects that international law. And so our original aim, if you like, was to encourage discussion in a forum where there was a treaty already in place, where there was an amendment procedure already in place that had been successfully used in the past, as a sort of already proven way of moving forward with a new element, if you like, to add to international criminal law. But also because we believe that if we approach this country by country, we would be there for decades. And of course, with big countries, we see that if you want to start from scratch, the conversation has to pass through 3, even 4 ministries: environment, justice, foreign, even defence ministries. And that can take an awfully long time. And so the aim was to aim for the international, the highest point, if you like, where the most serious crimes of concern to the international community are addressed. Because, and I think that now, perhaps that wasn't the case when we first started talking about it, but now I think it's virtually impossible to argue that severe harm to the environment is not of concern to the international community as a whole. However, what actually happened was really interesting, because with the emergence of the independent expert panel definition, the conversation really took wing, if you like, at the national level as well, and in national and regional levels as well. And so now we see, as was mentioned by Rodrigo earlier, there are many countries around the world that have proposals of law, proposing ecocide law to their national parliaments, and most, if not all of those, have had inspiration from or are sometimes based directly upon the independent expert panel definition. And of course, now with the international proposal also using that definition, there is a kind of coherence emerging already. And so what we're seeing is a kind of a sort of top-down, bottom-up mutual reinforcement happening. Because of course, the more countries take it up nationally, the more the international conversation moves forward. And the more the international conversation moves forward, the more countries want to join that conversation. So there is a kind of a snowballing effect that we're seeing happening, to the extent that the progress has been faster than we expected, not slower. And with international criminal law, as Thomas was saying to me over lunch, that's quite a phenomenon. To go from no governments talking about this issue to a formal proposal at the International Criminal Court, via an EU directive that lays foundations in a similar direction, in 5 years, for international law is rocket speed. It's very fast. And I think that there are a number of other reasons for that as well. There's a kind of general frustration, I believe, that's becoming more and more evident at all levels of society. And we interact with so many different sectors that we see this. We see it at grassroots level, we see it in the faith and academic and corporate and very many other areas, as well as in the corridors of the UN. And that is a frustration at how slow the pace of action is internationally, dealing with the level of environmental destruction and climate change that we're witnessing. And of course, vital ecosystems are also climate regulating ecosystems, which is where there's a really strong point of crossover from ecocide law to the climate situation. And while Daryl later will probably go into more aspects of the definition, there is one aspect that I think is very important, and that we didn't necessarily see how important it was when it first emerged, when the independent expert panel launched their definition in June 2021. And that is the way that the panel approached the definition as a consequence-based definition, rather than a definition based on a list of acts. And there were a number of reasons at the time, and it was interesting as convener hearing the discussions on the panel between the lawyers, because to begin with there was a fairly even split between whether it should be a list of acts or a consequence-based definition. And I think the consequence-based definition is very important for a number of reasons that were highlighted then. For example, if you don't include something in a list, people think it's permitted. And of course, as technologies and practices evolve over time, you can't be sure to be including all of those. And so a consequence-based definition remains dynamic over time. But from the perspective that we've seen emerging over the years, we would also say that a consequence-based definition has a different effect on actors who could be potential perpetrators. It triggers a different set of questions and a different attitudinal approach. And this we feel is very, very important. So at the moment, most of environmental law, not all, there are some crimes, of course, as this audience will know better than most, but most environmental law sits in the regulatory sphere and is very detailed and has lots of do's and don'ts. And the temptation for large corporations is to game that system. It's to say, oh, that particular activity is prohibited, but we're not doing that exactly, we're doing something a bit different, and so it's fine. Or to take a level of toxins in a certain context, right to the limit of what's possible. When you have a consequence-based definition, the approach is very different. Those people who are in decision-making positions actually have to ask the question, is what I'm signing off right now, is it going to create severe harm? What do I need to look into to see if it's going to create severe harm? What is the public domain information available about this thing? And most importantly, what questions should I be asking to ensure that I don't cross that line and have a tap on the shoulder for individual criminal responsibility? And that is a completely different attitude, and it's one that is far more likely to lead to changes in behaviour and to important questions that are not currently being asked. And so that, I feel, is a really important thing to raise in the context of what has been opened up now at the International Criminal Court. A couple of other aspects in the context of the ICC that I'd like to bring up. One is that, and I believe my Spanish isn't brilliant, but I believe from the contributions this morning that there was some talk about civil society, calling for something, calling for change. And we had been under the impression at Stop ECOCIDE International that we might have to engage further down the line in a big public awareness and persuasion campaign, if you like, or advocacy campaign, to show how important it is that we recognise the worst harms as crimes. But in fact, we've discovered that that may not be as necessary as we had thought. There was a major survey carried out in earlier this year by the Global Commons Alliance, and this was spoken about at some length by Sandrine Dixon de Clèves, who also spoke at the event in the Assembly of States Parties. She's the co-president of the Club of Rome. And they were involved in this survey that surveyed, I think, 22 or 23 countries, the G20 countries, plus some extras, including Denmark, actually. And what they found was that nearly 3/4 of respondents across a wide range of demographics in these countries, nearly 3/4 of the respondents already believe that ecocide should be a crime. One of the statements that was part of that survey was something along the lines of, it should be a criminal offence for big business leaders and senior government officials to approve or permit actions that are going to severely harm the environment. And there was an average of a 72% yes to that question. So what that tells us is that there is a strong public appetite already for this to move forward. And I mention it in relation to the ICC. It was obviously brought up last week, but also because I think this is also a major factor in countries coming behind this impetus to move this forward. Is knowing that, as politicians, knowing that their electorate are already in a receptive space to this move. And there was another thing from that survey showed that the general population have a strong sense that those who should take responsibility for what is happening to the planet, and of course as a result to communities and to people, is that it's business and government that must take the lead. Both must take the lead. And of course, what ecocide law can do is actually create the context, that sort of outer parameter within which those decisions can be taken that actually change behaviour to protect the environment and to protect people. There's a couple more aspects I'd like to bring in before I sort of finish this presentation, and one is the aspect of universality. As you all know, international criminal law at the moment is in quite a tricky position. There is a lot of conflicting or confusing, perhaps, positions being taken by some countries around what's been happening in recent months in regards to ongoing conflicts and arrest warrants issued in relation to those conflicts. And so there was definitely, I mean, at the ICC, there was this kind of sense of concern and of worry and of, and sort of underlying the conversations at the moment. And there is something about ecocide as a crime that brings the conversation, that broadens the conversation to something that is truly universal to everybody on this planet right now. So severe harm to nature and severe harm that influences potentially the climate situation as well is absolutely universal and does not have political boundaries, ideological boundaries. And so there is a way in which this is also a very important conversation for the international criminal law community to be looking at right now. And I don't think in our current predicament, as Rodrigo brought up earlier, as a civilizational question, I don't think there can be any avoiding of severe harm to nature as one of the most serious things facing the international community. And so there are some potential political and sort of advantages in the context of international criminal law of the universality of this. Not only, and this is something that the deputy prosecutor brought up, is that a certain number of countries actually joined the ICC Assembly as observers this year. We think probably because of the presence of the ECOCIDE conversation, a number of the Pacific Island states, for example, that are not members. And so there's also some potential support for the universality of the Rome Statute itself that comes in with this conversation, where there are countries that will be interested to join the conversation because of the environmental element. And I would venture to say that this is one of the key reasons that the Democratic Republic of Congo has very strongly come on board with this conversation. And again, I can't overstate the importance of that as of the DRC as a leading voice in Africa. Joining this conversation, and we now know that there are a number of other African countries that are interested, and there's a lot of interest as well from various countries in Latin America. So there is, and it was brought up earlier that there are a lot of states that are members of the ICC, and that could mean a long time, involving other states in a conversation. But I think we need to look to countries like Vanuatu to see the leadership that is possible in those areas, because Vanuatu actually led 130 countries to request the ICJ advisory opinion last year. So I think that there are things that can be done that perhaps people haven't always expected are possible, but they seem to be manifesting, which is very encouraging. And so I think I will probably conclude there for now, but to say that also to look at sort of next steps, if you like. The conversation is now open. Vanuatu has taken a very a sort of moderate and a very inclusive approach in the way that they've taken this into the state sphere, very much creating an open conversation and inviting other states to join this conversation. They're in no way pressurizing anybody to, push anything to votes immediately or anything of that kind, but just to say that this conversation is very important and it should be happening in the international criminal arena. And so there will be conversations ongoing in the working group on amendments, which will be meeting fairly regularly. It also has business to discuss around the crime of aggression still, and also there's another amendment on the table from Sierra Leone around slavery, so that will also be being discussed. So there will be plenty of opportunity over the coming months for states to join this conversation, and we obviously very warmly invite them to do that. And I would also just like to speak very, very briefly to something that one of the audience brought up over lunch, which is, what is the relationship of individual persons and legal persons in the way that the international criminal law addresses things, because of course the ICC can only address individuals. What I would note is that where this conversation is being brought up nationally and regionally, that the responsibility of legal persons has been brought into this. But that also it's very important. I think one of the key things at the ICC, so I think this is a really key consideration, initial consideration around ECOCIDE, is that individual criminal responsibility has a completely different level of deterrence to the corporate side of things. So if somebody, let's say a C-suite executive, is aware that the decisions that they make could lead them to personal loss of reputation and loss of freedom, that is a completely different consideration to the corporation being fined or to the corporation having to create compensation or restitution, which are both very necessary and important. But in terms of actually changing behavior, there's something very important about the individual criminal responsibility that also, of course, has a knock-on effect on the corporate reputation as well. And that's something that operates a bit differently to the existing international crimes. So I think that's a key thing to think about. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion later.
Yeah, thanks, Giorgio. Fascinating, and what a momentum. I mean, yeah, I look forward to coming back to that conversation once we get to the discussion. But for now, on to Kevin Heller in Copenhagen.
Comment period, literally in the next day or two, if not even today. So I want to begin my presentation by explaining a little bit about the policy development process up to now, and then I want to say a few words about policy itself. So in late February of 2024, not long after the prosecutor's speech in Paris, the OTP launched an initial public consultation on the environmental crimes policy. We requested input from any interested persons, states, or organizations concerning the specific crimes that should be included in the policy, how to understand the applicable modes of participation in those crimes, best practices for investigating and prosecuting environmental crimes, and how to consider environmental crimes in terms of cooperation and complementarity. We received about 80 submissions, including from states, IGOs, CSOs, legal scholars, and practitioners, and even corporations. Notable respondents included UNEP, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Right to Safe Drinking Water and Sanitation, and the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. We also engaged in direct consultations about the policy with interested parties such as UNODC, UNEP, and the head of the IPCC. So based on the comments from external stakeholders, as well as our own research, a colleague in the OTP and I produced a series of drafts of the policy. Those drafts received feedback from staff in all of the divisions of the OTP, as well as from relevant special advisors like myself, to improve the policy and to ensure that it harmonized with other relevant OTP policies and guidance documents. The deadline for public comments will be sometime in late February. With the help of Kate McIntosh's Promise Institute Europe and our Colombian legal fellow, Laura Barron Mendoza, who I think is in the audience, online anyway, we will analyze the comments and produce a final draft of the policy for the prosecutor's approval. Along the way, we'll hold a number of consultations on the policy, some online and at least one in person at the court, and we intend to launch the policy in late 2025, somewhere outside of Europe, most likely at one of the COPs in Latin America. So that's a little background. Let me now turn to the policy itself, which has 4 parts. The introduction itself does 5 things. First, it explains the importance of the policy, the role that environmental damage and climate change play in fomented conflict, the need for international cooperation to combat environmental crimes, and the seriousness of the environmental crimes that have already been committed in situations the office is currently investigating, such as Ukraine and Palestine. Second, the introduction provides what we believe, or at least hope, are clear and precise definitions of what the policy means by environment, environmental damage, and environmental crime. That's not an easy task because none of those terms have a set definition in international law. Now, the definitions of the policy are as follows. Natural environment is defined as the Earth's biosphere, cryosphere, lithosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere, including outer space, And that definition follows and is really basically directly taken from the IEP commentary, which I know you've already heard about. Environmental damage is defined as any loss or deterioration of the environment. Importantly, such loss or deterioration includes the impact on the health and well-being of a particular ecosystem's non-human, as well as human inhabitants. Environmental crimes, in turn, are defined as crimes under Article 5 of the Rome Statute that are committed either by means of or that result in environmental damage. So the following types of acts are covered by the policy. Most obviously, we have Article 8.2b4 of the Rome Statute, the war crime of launching a disproportionate attack, which expressly refers to environmental damage as one of its legal elements. We also have Rome Statute crimes committed by means of environmental damage, making the damage a material fact relevant to establishing an element of the crime and or the actus reus of the mode of liability. So for example, poisoning a water supply with the intent to displace an indigenous people who live there, the war crime or crime against humanity of deportation or forcible transfer. We also have Rome Statute crimes resulting in environmental damage, making the damage contextual information relevant to assessing the gravity of the crime, as well as for informing selection and prioritization, sentencing, and reparations. So for example, the war crime of deliberately attacking civilian objects, that attack might be directed against the built environment, but it will of course inevitably harm the natural environment as well. Third, the introduction lays out the primary objectives of the policy. They include to affirm the prosecutor's commitment to the rigorous prosecution of environmental crimes, thereby contributing to remedying the historical neglect of such crimes, to encourage and support national efforts to repress environmental crimes and other activities involving unlawful environmental damage, to cooperate with and coordinate civil society organizations and other non-state actors whose expertise or access to information enables them to support law enforcement action at either the international or national level, and to contribute to the development of international jurisprudence and best practices concerning the prosecution of environmental crimes at the ICC and beyond. Fourth, this is very important, the introduction will emphasize the need for the OTP to always take an intersectional approach to environmental crimes. An intersectional approach acknowledges the way individuals and communities can have disparate positions of power and vulnerability due to differences of identity, including not only race and gender, including sexual orientation and gender identity, but also ethnicity, socioeconomic status, religion, and disability. And then fifth and finally, the introduction clearly lays out the limits on the OTP's ability to prosecute environmental crimes. Most importantly, it emphasizes that the OTP's efforts can never exceed the jurisdictional, substantive, and procedural provisions of the Rome Statute. The policy specifically points out, for example, that the court has no jurisdiction over the crime of ecocide. That's not something that we'll be able to prosecute until such time as an amendment is adopted. The section also notes, perhaps a little regretfully, that the Rome Statute is primarily anthropocentric, focusing on harms to humans, which means that the OTP will almost always be limited to investigating and prosecuting environmental crimes that at least have some adverse effect on individuals and groups. So that's the introduction. The second section of the draft policy explains precisely what kinds of environmental crimes are within the four corners of the Rome Statute. The section goes systematically through genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and oppression, using both real and hypothetical examples that highlight, whenever possible, the policy's intersectionality. Now, I think that this section of the policy is particularly important to convey to outside observers, particularly those who are pushing to make ecocide the fifth international crime, that it is easy to underestimate the extent to which environmental damage can, in fact, be prosecuted under the Rome Statute, even with its anthropocentric focus. So I think it won't surprise you when I say that the second section really focuses on crimes against humanity and war crimes. In terms of crimes against humanity, the emphasis is on crimes like extermination, deportation or forcible transfer, persecution, and other inhumane acts. Once again, the emphasis is on how those crimes can be committed against vulnerable individuals, particularly members of indigenous peoples, given their unique relationship to the environment. In terms of war crimes, we focus on intentional attacks against civilian objects, noting, of course, that the environment is by default itself a civilian object. We focus on the destruction and appropriation of property, pillaging, starvation, and attacking specially protected objects, such as those dedicated to culture. The third section of the policy discusses how to operationalize the prosecutor's statement that the OTP will systematically address environmental crimes in all stages of its work. Taking the need for systematicity seriously, the section goes carefully through preliminary examinations, investigation, the selection and prioritization of cases for prosecution, and sentencing. And throughout, it emphasizes the need for the OTP to work closely with a variety of partners outside the court, from states to international organizations like UNEP, to grassroots communities and activists. Now, mindful of time, I don't want to get into the third section in too much detail, and you'll be able to read it for yourself very soon. Let me just say that I believe that this section heeds the prosecutor's desire to develop a policy that is as innovative as possible. And I think you see that innovation in two basic ways. To begin with, this section tries to put the new policy on complementarity and cooperation to full use, explaining how the OTP can promote and enhance national efforts to prosecute environmental damage. Such assistance can include the sharing of intelligence, evidence, and situation briefs, undertaking joint investigative activities, such as the OTP is doing in Ukraine, holding strategic consultation on case selection and prioritization to share the burden of prosecuting Rome Statute crimes with states, providing assistance to states concerning how to legislate in the area of environmental crimes, and facilitating the flow of information and evidence between states when environmental crimes have a transnational element, as they often do. The section also emphasizes the accountability of corporate actors, a point of particular importance to the prosecutor. Now, the policy makes clear that the OTP can only prosecute individual officers within corporations, not corporations as legal persons. But the section also emphasizes that the OTP can and will use its powers to prosecute corporate officers who use corporations to commit environmental crimes. Now, the final section of the policy paper discusses how the OTP will actually implement the policy. A little bit of inside baseball, but in particular, it emphasizes the need for the OTP to recruit staff with expertise in the investigation, analysis, and prosecution of environmental crimes, for existing OTP staff to be trained to recognize the environmental dimensions of the crimes they are investigating, for the OTP to rely on external expertise when needed, and for the OTP to consistently and continuously monitor its practices and procedures regarding environmental crimes. So, to wrap up, I believe that the development of the environmental crimes policy is, in fact, a landmark development for the court and for environmental justice generally, and I'm honored to be leading the process. That said, we must never forget the ICC's limitations. The court is perennially understaffed and underfinanced, and that means the OTP will never be able to prosecute anything more than a small handful of environmental crimes. Moreover, because of the Rome Statute's anthropocentric focus, the prosecutions the OTP will bring will almost inevitably focus on environmental damage that harms humans. The OTP's new environmental crimes policy, therefore, needs to be seen as one piece of the environmental justice puzzle. An important piece, to be sure, but a small one. The ICC is often seen as the court of first resort, when it is designed to be the court of last resort. International prosecutions of environmental crimes will always be necessary, particularly when states are complicit in harming the environment, or the bad actor is a particularly powerful multinational corporation. But environmental justice will never be more than an abstract ideal if states and civil society do not take the lead. We need states to adopt stronger environmental laws. We need states to prosecute environmental crimes domestically, and neither of those things will happen without the constant efforts of civil society. And that is perhaps the most important role the ICC can play, catalyzing and supporting national efforts at environmental justice. The OTP can develop and share evidence with states. It can help states communicate with each other. It can bring international attention to the concerns of activists. It can, in short, to use a metaphor that the prosecutor has often used, be the hub that all the spokes connect to. That, in any case, is the OTP's goal, and we believe that the new policy on environmental crimes is a first step toward achieving it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kevin, for joining in from Copenhagen, and as always, for being to the point and being on time as well. much appreciated. Hopefully released. For now, we will base our conversation about it based on what you said in your presentation. So let's move on to our expert reflections. It seems Karen and Daryl and Marina all online, so that should be good. And we have Rodrigo with us here, so I'm gonna hand over the floor to Rodrigo, and then we come back to our other three expert commentators after that, and Giorgio will stay up here too, so that's excellent.
I'm not sure if the screen is sharing.
I think we need to go into Blackboard first. What happened?
Yeah, it's already over there.
Are you wanting to show the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is
Okay, it's showing.
Is it being shared also to the online audience? Rodrigo's PowerPoint's visible? Just check.
Okay, well, I will start. So thank you very much. What I'm going to do is to add more information to this room regarding what's happened at national level. So Kevin Heller says something about reinforce environmental crimes at national level as an important topic, and I want to go inside of this. Of course, we have in 2021 the international expert panel definition, but what happened when we moved the campaign in different countries is that some parliamentarians take actions, presenting bill of ecocide law at national parliaments. So I will just say some few words about this. If you can see the screen, well, we already was mentioned here what happened in Belgium, what happened in European Union, Netherlands, Italy are other examples of ecocide law at national levels, bill of law. Well, regarding Latin America's country, which is my topic today, we have a lot of bill of ecocide law, like Bolivia, like Mexico, like Brazil, Peru, Argentina, Chile, and Colombia. Those countries have already a bill of ecocide law in their parliaments, or just in the just to present in the next few months, or had in the past some bill of ecocide law, which is I think very important to take into account. Those experiences are different, and I will say some few words about each of them. Well, regarding Bolivia, for example, the bill of ecocide law was presented in April 2024 with no coordination of Stop Ecocide Foundation, which is great. Which is no problem to have a coordination with us, but trying to ensure that maintain coherence regarding the international definition and national definition could be good if we have this kind of coordination. Yeah, okay, this is the presentation. Well, regarding the definition was not related to the international expert panel. Well, I have a mistake here. Was April, no, 2024 is 2017. This is a mistake in this presentation. I'm sorry. Was this bill of ecocide law was before the independent expert panel, and this definition is more related to trade and serious damage to ecosystem and the right of Pachamama. Well, this is another country, Brazil. The bill of ecocide law was presented in the parliament in June 5th, 2023, and this bill of ecocide law is in coordination with Stop Ecocide. Some of the members of the international panel also support this initiative. Richard Roger, the deputy chair of the international expert panel, support this initiative and make advisor of this. Well, the definition is close related to the definition of the international expert panel, and my comment is that the definition is very similar, and the first legislative phase was already complete. Another bill of ecocide law was in July 30th, 2023, without coordination of Stop Ecocide. The parliamentarian just copy-paste the definition and launched the bill of ecocide law. The definition is, yes, related to the international one, and my comment is that it was just an spontaneous initiative, and this is not the idea. The idea is try to make, in some cases, regarding especially the civil law countries, some adaptation to the international definition to the domestic legislation, because some topics must be faced, for example, regarding principle of legality, or more development of some words, some concepts, for example. Well, another case is Peru. I visit Peru in May of this year, and after that we collect 3 bill of ecocide law, because the political situation over there is that the politicians in the parliament compete between them, and so one win the title of the first bill of ecocide law, and the other one is the best of ecocide law, or something like this. So, well, at the end, we have today one bill of ecocide law. There was mixed, composed in just one. And yes, and this composition was with the advisor of Stop Ecocide. And the definition of ecocide over there in this bill of ecocide law is very related to the international expert panel. Another case is Colombia. Colombia has already the crime of ecocide in the criminal code in August 4th, 2021, before the international expert panel. So it was without our coordination, and the definition is far related to the international expert panel. It's more close to the crimes against humanity, because the wording say that the damage to the environment must be systematic and massive. and this is more related to the international, the crimes against humanity than the definition of international expert panel. So another case is my country, which is Chile. In last year, adopt a new law of economic and environmental crimes, and similarly to European Union, include cases comparable to ECOCIDE. Yes, and they don't call, the law don't call ECOCIDE, but include most of the elements of crime of ECOCIDE. Another case is Argentina. Argentina has no bill of ECOCIDE law yet, but we are preparing, without our support, a new bill of ECOCIDE, and is, yes, related to the definition and is with our support. And just to mention in 1 minute some key aspects to take into account when you want to define at national level the crime of ecocide. One of them is, what do we want to protect? Is a legal protected word. The other one is the action or omission, because in some legislation you must to be explicit, saying that this crime include omissions. The other topic is normative element of the action, which is unlawful or wanton. What happened regarding wanton in those countries that already have a strong environmental legal protection. Other topic is factual element of the consequences, which is severe, widespread, and long-term or long-term is the other topic that we must take into account. 5, subjective element, or mens rea in English, which is dolus eventualis. This is, for me, this is the most important element. I think if we don't include dolus eventualis in a definition of ecocide, the definition will not will be useful to protect the environment, because in peacetime, my content is that fortunately we don't have like Pinky and the Brain, the devil or some bad guy that wants to destroy the Amazon and want to destroy the forest because he hates the forest or something like this. That means that direct intent is not an issue in peacetime. So what happened in peacetime is more related to some people that wants to develop a business, and this business is dangerous to the environment. They don't take care enough measures to prevent damage. So that means that we need to include dolus eventualis. Of course, at national level, we can consider negligence or other kind, less restrictive kind of mens rea, but at least we need to include dolus eventualis. And number 6 is endangerment crime. The ecocide at the international level is defined as endangerment crime, and I hope that at national level we also do the same. Yes, final words to the audience or to some parliamentarian that hear this speech or wants to do something in their internal legislation. Please contact us. We only want to support your initiative. That's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rodrigo, and let's continue to follow the order of the program. So we will move to Daryl.
Give some reactions. I thought the policy outlined by Kevin sounds very promising. I like there were some helpful distinctions there between Rome Statute crimes committed through environmental means versus Rome Statute crimes that have environmental impacts. The latter goes more to gravity and prioritization. I thought that's helpful. I think it's a smart idea for the policy to emphasize limits, like in the way that Kevin outlined. I recall there were the Office of the Prosecutor put out a policy on selection and prioritization at one point and mentioned that it would look at environment as an aggravating factor. And there was a lot of the commentaries all reacted negatively, thinking the ICC is suddenly going to do crimes it doesn't have jurisdiction over, which was never the case. So I think that's really smart to preempt that kind of thing. And I like the line about how it's only, the ICC is only one piece of the environmental puzzle, and the importance of national efforts. And then Jojo gave us a very helpful discussion of how the conversation about adding ECOCIDE to the ICC statute has started. It's going to be a long road. It's going to help as states get more and more familiar with the idea. In my imagination, there's a two-way process. The more we discuss it at the Assembly of States parties, the more states get familiar with it, and it might make its way into national laws. And the more we get it into national laws, the more comfortable states are going to be. What I wanted to do in my little comment, I want to talk about a slightly different angle. The workshop splits us into national efforts, like in Spain, and then the International Criminal Court efforts. And in between that, there's, I guess I would call it transnational. And that's something that really interests me. I'm really interested in getting a wave of national legislation, strengthening environmental criminal law. The EU directive is a great start on that, at least within that region. But my idea is we get 40 countries, 60 countries, then 80 countries all strengthening their national laws. For this, what's lovely about it is we don't need to wait for the ICC amendment. And we don't even need a treaty. Some people think, oh, it's either ICC statute or treaty. Treaties are slow. The Crime Against Humanity Convention, which in my mind is just a bunch of very sensible, everything in the Crime Against Humanity Convention is perfectly sensible, and that thing is, the states are coming up with reasons to take 2 more years to think about this or that, right? So treaties are slow. So what I'm picturing is all you would need is a declaration by states or some sort of model law, something that just helps them coordinate their actions a bit. And I'll tell you my vision for this model law. I picture ECOCIDE as being the capstone. ECOCIDE is the worst of the environmental crimes. We use all the momentum behind ECOCIDE to draw states in because they want to talk about ECOCIDE, so that's where the momentum is. So ECOCIDE is if it's a pyramid, ECOCIDE is at the top of this pyramid. And then on top of that, we also then, while you're passing this ECOCIDE law, you should also strengthen your criminal law dealing with lesser environmental offenses, things that don't have the same impact as ECOCIDE or maybe are not committed with subjective mens rea, like negligence. But the part that really excites me is adding in a suite of environmental crimes that could apply extraterritorially, and they would apply even in armed conflict. So for example, a new environmental war crime. The ICC statute has Article 82b4, but that's actually just the principle of proportionality. It mentions the environment, but it's not created specifically as an environmental war crime. In Additional Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, in Article 35 and 55, there's a prohibition on widespread, long-term, severe environmental damage. That provision was never turned into a grave breach, but I think it would be totally plausible to turn that into a crime on its own right. It's serious. It would meet the Tadich test for criminalization, so that's an easy win. Environmental crimes against humanity, there's a lot of challenges. I've researched trying to use crimes against humanity against environmental conduct. It's tricky, but a provision could just specify, for example, that the other inhumane acts includes poisoning a city would be an inhumane act, right? Poisoning a city with toxic heavy metals is an inhumane act, and causing massive increases in the statistical death mortality rates. So the idea for an environmental crime against humanity, it's not even stretching customary law, it's just articulating that certain things are inhumane acts. Articulating certain things that are obviously inhumane, recognizing them as inhumane acts. Environmental genocide would be another one. Environmental terrorism, you could just use the formula that's used in all the terrorist conventions. So it would be threatening massive harm against the environment to intimidate a population or to compel a government. So that formula of intimidating a population or compelling a government, that's in all the terrorist conventions. Environmental terrorism can happen, I think. So those would be another package of ideas, is strengthening these transnational laws. Then there's also related crimes like environmental fraud. That could get elevated to taken more seriously. So there's a whole package of relatively easy, in my mind, to improve criminal law. And then in addition, maybe this is getting too ambitious, but while states are at it, they could strengthen their basic administrative and civil rules. A lot of environmental impact assessments, especially for large-scale projects, they're very permissive. So, you know, maybe that's too much to ask states, but it could just, the thing could say, hey, could you take another look and strengthen this? Because some of the stuff getting approved should never be getting approved. So that's all I'll say, is just this idea. I wanted to add this in-betweeny option. So there's national effort, there's international criminal court effort. I support both of those. But in addition, I just wanted to put on the table my idea for a transnational criminal law approach and a wave of national legislation, adding ECOCIDE and also these other environmental international crimes. And thank you very much.
Great, thanks Daryl for coming Marina with us. So, what do we go?
Karen first on the list.
Yeah, Karen, you want to go first?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear and see you. Okay, so that's perfect.
I don't know what's going on with the lighting in here. I'm in the same building as Marina.
Right. It's a bit dark, yeah. It's a bit dark,
yeah.
but we see you. It's all right. We see you. We see you.
Just yeah.
Great. Thanks for joining. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank
you.
Yeah, floor is yours. We already introduced a long time ago. I don't know if you were already online at the point, but yeah, go on, please. Thanks again.
So thank you, obviously, to the organisers, to Thomas, to Monsi and Matey, and of course thank you to Kevin and Jojo for their papers. I think what I want to do is really focus more on Kevin's area, if I can say that. So first of all, thank you to Kevin. It's good to see that the policy is due to come out soon. I think we've all been really excited by this latest development, and I think the areas that Kevin has outlined today are even just those few comments, I think, are full of things that we can already see that the policy is going to really be, I think, something that we can discuss in our teams and then get back and review, because I think there's a lot of exciting things in there. So again, thank you to Kevin, to the OTP and the ICC colleagues for that. So looking at some of the issues I think that Kevin raised in the paper today, as I say, there were a lot of key issues in there on how the policy could look, and there seems to be a lot to celebrate at this point. My comments will focus on maybe 3 or 4 areas. And the first, following on from Daryl a little bit, is Article 8(2)(b)(4) of the Rome Statute, which is that war crime of intentionally launching a disproportionate attack, which includes environmental damage. Kevin wasn't able to say much more today, I think, or wasn't able to say much on this, but I think it's going to be interesting to see if the policy analyzes the threshold terms of widespread, long-term and severe damage to the natural environment. One of the issues with the threshold, I think, as we all know, as used by the Rome Statute, has been the question, and indeed IHL, has been the question of how that threshold would be defined. And clearly in IHL, we've also struggled on this issue as well, those concepts. For example, would the notion of environmental damage be sufficiently forward-looking to include or to estimate future reverberating harms, notably impacts on future ecosystems, particularly health, and thinking about predator and prey species as well, from damage caused to, say, rivers, soil, and species from maybe the pollution by hazardous pollutants. So it's important to include reverberating environmental impacts and things like the cumulative and synergistic impacts as well within estimates of damage. In terms of the scale of harm, particularly again, how do we measure severe harm? Using a progressive approach to environmental protection, the definitions should clearly take into account particular fragility or uniqueness of affected ecosystems, such as environmentally protected areas or natural heritage sites, or particular endangered species or habitats. And I think therefore we need to recognise that weight needs to be given to damage done to particularly important or rare habitats or species. And the issue with the threefold cumulative threshold of harm is of course widely known, including the notion that severe and long-term harm would not necessarily occur on a widespread scale, unless you took the view that, say, the extinction of a species or subspecies in one location has a widespread impact, potentially regionally or globally, in the sense of, say, the impact on biodiversity more generally. So the second thing I wanted to look at briefly is definitions. Kevin gave us some definitions, which again I thought were really interesting. And I welcome therefore the definition, particularly of environmental damage that was provided, which refers to any loss or deterioration. And so I know, first of all, this doesn't have an inherent threshold of damage. This in itself reads to be a low threshold of harm, although I appreciate, of course, it's going to be coupled with a very significant thresholds of harm in relation to specific Rome Statute crimes, i.e. the most grave crimes, for example, that will be the subject of ICC prosecution. I note, again, the overriding limit in the area on anthropocentric harms, that the OTP will almost always be limited to investigating and prosecuting environmental crimes that have at least some adverse effect on people. However, in the definition of environmental damage that Kevin specified, that it can include the impact on the well-being of non-human inhabitants. And so I'm interested to know more about this notion of well-being, for example, of species. I think it sounds a very advanced definition of harm to species, and thus a welcome advancement, I think, to include such a broad and forward-thinking definition. And I won't say any more because I know my colleague Marina is going to cover this aspect more in her talk. So finally, just a couple more points. Again, really good to see that Kevin had included notions of evidence collection and standards. I think one of the first issues raised during the Ukraine conflict with outside organizations was the question of evidence collection protocols and preservation of such evidence in relation to environmental damage. Ukraine was able to draw on expertise, including from colleagues who worked on cases at the UN Compensation Commission. And so it's clearly an invaluable area to further develop and clarify in the ICC's practice and the policy. And of course, there are now many scientific tools, of course, that can be used and even accessed remotely to help in gathering and retaining such evidence. Although there is also, it has to be said, a strong need still for ground truthing and clearly the collection of environmental samples. Fourthly, I welcome the specific mention of corporate actors and the focus on prosecuting corporate officers who use corporations to commit environmental crimes in the ways outlined, of course, in the existing provisions in Article 5, including, of course, being complicit in those crimes. I think encouraging greater adoption at the domestic level of corporate criminal liability for environmental crimes. I think, again, as Daryl's just mentioned, it's a significant way through which the ICC could work more closely with states and would help to implement the International Law Commission's work on what we call the PERAC principles, protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict, particularly those on corporate liability, particularly Principle 11. And then finally, I wanted to mention again something, I think, to follow up maybe on what Daryl has just said, which is outside now, Kevin's comments, outside the ICC context, is the process that's going on in the UN at the minute with the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. So noting the lack of an environmental provision so far in that draft, and probably it will stay that way. Excuse me. So in its original draft articles, the International Law Commission declined to look at the issue of environmental crimes specifically. And as I said, the policy document, as Kevin outlined, can't add new crimes to the Rome Statute, or at least not easily. But there's still an opportunity within this separate process within the UN to include a provision that specifically refers to intentional environmental damage that forms part of a sort of widespread or systematic attack or action against a civilian population. And one or two of my colleagues in the IUCN WCEL, the specialist group, have proposed a 12th crime in the ILC draft articles to criminalize widespread, long-lasting or severe destruction of the natural environment as a means of destruction, damage or injury to any civilian population within the notion of crimes against humanity. So we think there's scope to explicitly mention in that particular treaty, should it be adopted, what has not been possible so far in the Rome Statute, the crimes against humanity. And I think largely because of the developments, the ECOCIDE developments, all the separate developments in human rights, the right to a healthy environment, for example, and in environmental law, more largely, particularly in the area of climate change. Because of all these developments, there maybe is that state momentum, whereas of course there wasn't in 1998 when the Rome Statute was adopted. I'll stop there. Thank you, and pass over to Thomas and Marina. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Thomas, to Jojo and Kevin for the presentations and for the comments and for letting me your office here. So, and thanks also for mentioning the species, because I wasn't sure whether I wanted to bring something up connected to animals, but I think I will. Sorry, I ran upstairs. I'm catching my breath. Right. So, I would like to make 3 comments that are actually more questions than comments. And the first one connects to the definition of ecocides. I know it wasn't particularly, or it was not the focus of today, but I need to ask the animal question or else I will explode, because I have a training in animal law background. I have a background in animal law. So the first point I wanted to ask is about animals. The second is that, connected to the draft policy paper, I'd like to question the seemingly divide between humans and environment that the draft policy paper seems to assume, if I picked on what Kevin said correctly. And lastly, I'd like to comment and question about the unique opportunity that this draft policy paper brings in relation to clarifying whether the environment or actually environmental agencies can qualify as victims in the sense of the Rome Statute and the rules of procedure and evidence. So, turning to my first point on the definition of the environment that the ECOCIDE proposal lays down, it says, or it mentions the biosphere, which presumably encompasses fauna and flora. However, the only more direct reference, although not express, to animals is the mention of the term species within the definition of widespread. Beyond geographical era, them or species.
Sorry, the connection seems to be breaking, Marina.
Affects an entire species. However, causing damage to an entire species would normally already cross state boundaries. And that's because a lot of the species exist in a transboundary fashion. For example, there are 4 different species of giraffe in Africa, and none of which is confined to one country. And to make sure that I'm not cherry picking on just one type of animal, that happens as well with the jaguar. Thank you. In South America and Central America, with lions in Africa, with monkeys in Asia, and of course with migratory birds. So an ecocidal act that affects an entire species will normally already include or entail a cross-boundary aspect to it, already meeting the widespread, all the thresholds of cross-border effects. So I suppose the added value of adding species to the definition is to capture those animals, those species that inhabit a very limited geographical area. So my curiosity-driven question is, apart from this, is there any special concern paid to animals in the current proposed definition, in the sense that apart from acts that affect an entire species, in what instances would harm to animals meet the threshold of ecocide? And maybe there are no more, because as Dario was saying, this is the capstone, this is the pinnacle in a negative sense of crimes against the environment. But it's just curiosity. Turning to my second point, and I'm focusing more on the draft policy paper and in Kevin's presentation, is the assumed divide between human and the environment that I detected might be present in the draft policy paper. Kevin's presentation made reference to the Rome Statute anthropocentric stance to say that prosecutions will mostly focus on environmental harm that affects humans, individuals or groups. And my counter question is, what type of environmental damage does not have an adverse effect on humans, be it individuals or groups? Just like the draft policy paper is going to deal with intersectionality, and I think that's very positive, in my humble opinion, it would also be recommendable, if it already doesn't do that, to engage with literature concerning the Anthropocene. And this would imply identifying, questioning, and engaging with this assumption that seems to be behind the statement that there are only some environmental crimes that would affect humans. And that assumption is that there is a hyper separation between humans and the environment, save for those exceptional cases that deal with indigenous peoples and the like. The human-environment divide, studies about the Anthropocene would say, is more an assumption than a fact that has been inherited from the hegemony of modern thought, and that has prevailed in modern times as well, because the Holocene allowed us to believe or to underestimate the extent to which humans are intertwined with nature and with other species. The Enlightenment and modernity painted the picture that the environment is some sort of inert background and a site of supervision and extraction, but this is a mirage and is an artificial belief. We have evidence, perhaps not meeting the threshold of criminal prosecutions, but evidence nonetheless in the form of melting glaciers and sinking islands, torrential rains and hurricanes, that we have made a profound miscalculation of the extent to which we affect the environment and vice versa. Perhaps the policy will arrive at the same conclusion, that it has to focus on crimes that have a patent and very recognizable effect on human beings, temporally and geographically, because of the constraints of criminal prosecutions and their evidentiary standards. But at the very least, reaching this conclusion would have involved an entirely different line of thinking and a shift in the discourse. Namely that the OTP must focus on environmental crimes that have a clear causal and temporal effect on individuals and groups, not because they are the only ones that affect humans, but rather because of the operation of the criminal legal framework does not allow looking beyond those. And my third and last point is that the publication of the draft policy, or like actually the final policy, is a unique opportunity to explore if environmental agencies can qualify as victims under Rule 85B of the Rules of Procedure and Evidence. And the OTP might be reluctant to say, we don't want to go into victim discourses because they are participants to the case and their representatives run their own parallel case, and then when reparations come, we're not even part of the proceedings, which is true. However, I would counter-argue that the Rome Statute operates under the general principle, which is enshrined in Rule 86 of the Rules of Procedure and Evidence, according to which a chamber in making any direction or order and other organs of the court in performing their functions under the statute and the rules shall take into account the needs of all victims and witnesses in accordance with Article 68. In particular, the OTP has the obligation to take into account victims' interests in relation to proprio motu investigations, according to Article 53(1)(c) of the Rome Statute. And their own 2010 prosecutorial strategy said that as an organ conducting investigations and prosecutions, the office interacts with victims to address the full range of criminality. So it seems that a key preliminary question that the OTP needs to address to fulfill these duties, perhaps before any other organ in the ICC, is who are these victims, or what are these victims, so that they know who they need to consult with. So the question is, do organizations or governmental agencies whose purpose is to preserve the environment qualify as victims under Rule 85B? And I think the answer is yes, but if the policy paper agreed and said the same, the prospects of bringing ecologically driven views and concerns to the case, to the courtroom, and of obtaining reparations for the environment would increase exponentially. And that's all on my side. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Marina. And with that, thanks again to all our presenters and expert commentators. So with that, it's time to open up the floor for debate. And I know Kevin has to run in just a few minutes, I believe. So maybe to start with coming back to you. Oh, has to leave now, right? Yeah, okay. Then.
I have a couple of seconds.
Right, great. Go on.
I mean, I don't actually have too much in the way of substantive response because we're still at the phase of gathering precisely these kinds of comments. And I guess what I would say, just as kind of a caveat for how we have to think about these things, is that ultimately this will be a policy paper issued by the Office of the Prosecutor. There are a lot of issues that are of incredibly deep intellectual and philosophic and theoretical interest that we will, of course, in some ways always be commenting on, if only indirectly, but it's not an academic article, and there are a lot of things that we just are simply not going to be able to do in it. These policy papers are designed to let interested stakeholders know how we think through these issues. There are some issues that we will, of course, have to discuss. The very important question of, how much damage does one have to cause? What is the relationship between, as Marina was talking about, can we really say that a crime doesn't affect humans? Well, of course not. But we also, as she also quite rightly pointed out, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that not only is this a policy paper, this is a criminal court that has an obligation to pursue crimes based on whether the suspect has committed the actus reus with the necessary mens rea. And so there will be very difficult causation issues that have to structure all of our discussion. And I would not claim to say that we have solved them all or even thought through them all right now. But again, these are just the things that interested people have to be aware that we will be doing in these policy. And inevitably, there will be issues that deserve much fuller, much more philosophic and theoretic treatment than we probably will be able to do actually in the paper itself. So partly it's just to prepare everybody for a little bit of disappointment, but I hope that that the policy itself is exciting enough and that we can do enough that people will find in it things to be very excited about. So I think I'll just leave it at that and just say thank you so much for all the comments, and we will be taking them into account. You will have the draft paper in a day or two, and please do avail yourself of the opportunity to submit written comments to us, because we will read everyone and we will take them all very seriously.
Great, thanks Kevin for coming back in, and we really look forward to seeing the policy paper in a few days, as you say. So good to have you as always, and thanks to you in Copenhagen. And I think we can now open up the floor for questions, including our questions and comments, including our online participants. So if online participants would like to come in, please raise your hand. And maybe Jojo, do you want to react to any of the commentaries that were given by our expert panelists before we move to?
I can do if there's no pending questions right now. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's sort of emerging for me is that there seems to be a real kind of confluence or convergence of various aspects, both of the ECOCIDE issue, but also other related developments around dealing with environmental crimes, around the relationship of legal obligations of states with the climate. That there are a whole bunch of legal developments that have emerged in the last few years that seem to be kind of converging in a way that is, we hope, positive, that effectively is going to, in fact, I think we're already beginning to lead to some of the things that were asked for, if I understood correctly from the Spanish this morning. For example, more of an emphasis on training of judiciary, but also, I would bring in things like, new kinds of evidence, different types of expert witness, for example, those who have the environmental and scientific knowledge, as well as kind of on the ground communities and so on, and evidence that comes from those different areas. So I think that there's a whole sort of raft of developments that are starting to kind of grow up around this whole impetus that, perhaps one could see ecocide law as the sort of pointy end of. I often do this thing where, imagine if you're drawing a pen through water, with sort of ecocide law being the pen, it's very precise actually. It's not trying to, as Rodrigo says, it's not a panacea. It's not trying to fix everything, but there's something about naming the worst harms as crimes, and that being the sort of conceptual tip of the spear, if you like. But as you draw that, let's say through water, what you end up with a large wake behind you, and it feels like a lot of the issues that have come up today are, brilliantly sort of evocative of that kind of wake and that sort of direction of travel, which on the whole I feel is overdue. And yes, but let's be glad it's happening.
Great, yeah. Who wants to come in or come back? Yeah.
Microphone.
We have in 1 second, yeah. You're welcome to come up here if you want, yeah. Right, okay. Whatever works.
Well, I will assume that it works.
It does, yeah.
Thank you for the amazing presentation. For a PhD student, it's lovely to be here. So I believe that my question could be addressed to any of you, so feel free to stand up and answer. So I'm aware that the Stop Ecocide Independent Expert Panel tried to sidestep the problems related with the threshold of severe, widespread, long-term damage, in contrast to the additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions, by lowering the threshold and additionally giving a specific definition for any of the elements. And I also am aware that the panel chose to keep with the wording because it was a familiar language in international law, right? But my concerns are that while states could be familiar with the wording, they could also be more sensitive or feel more familiar also with the understanding under the additional protocol 1. You mean in the sense of widespread, meaning decades, meaning hundreds of kilometers, and long-term meaning decades long impact. So I wonder if that could end up in being more problematic than helpful.
Great, thanks for that question. Should we check if there are any other comments, reflections? Otherwise, I got one myself. So maybe to chip in before we come back to our speakers. So yeah, thanks again to all really fascinating presentations and commentaries. So if we kind of look at this as being at the stage of norm creation and norm adoption at this point, and we try to collectively look forward, assuming that everyone who is with us here would like to achieve better and more meaningful accountability for environmental crimes, what do our experts and presenters sort of see as the biggest challenge to get that meaningful norms of enforcement? So what are the biggest obstacles that you have identified in your work from moving from that phase of norms adoption to actually seeing a practice where environmental crimes are increasingly prosecuted and perpetrators in other ways held to account? And not to guide that question, but how does all of this play out in the current global order context where, I mean, at many other levels it's quite difficult to be an optimist. I think it's fair to say, but yeah, we can be quite optimistic about how norms adoption is proceeding with ECOCIDE, but yeah, how is this going to translate into practice? So that would be sort of my own open-ended question to all of our presenters and expert comments. And Daryl, do you want to come in and reflect on anything that has been said, commented on?
That's such a great question you asked, and that's funny to me that you jumped to me. Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a daunting moment with the leadership in a lot of the biggest countries of the world. So it doesn't seem like we're entering into a moment of progressive international law. The odds are we're going to move into something a little more anarchic. But I guess my optimistic take would be there's always 10,000 things happening all at once. So it's actually perfectly possible for, who knows what kind of crazy, difficult things are going to be happening on the macro scale. But I think that won't stop countries that care from moving along with a file like the ECOCIDE file or strengthening their environmental criminal law. In fact, sometimes the presence of a bullying figure sometimes makes states double down on the occasional progressive project. So I think there's maybe reason to hope that this might be a little bit insulated from those bigger picture trends. But of course, I'm just expressing opinions. Feel free to disagree.
Karen, Marina, any of you would like to come back with any additional follow-up commentary?
Yeah, I can just, I mean, very briefly, it's, I guess the same challenges of enforcement, for example, for your question, Thomas, that we've always seen. And again, with the ICC, I think Kevin was very clear on that, really, that there's always a lack of resources. And we know in the environment sense that it will be, you know, a priority to some extent, but we also know that there are also really serious crimes being still committed that we thought would have been, well, should have been never committed, you know, from 50, 60 years ago, as we've seen in recent conflicts, of course. So there always will be that, I guess, I want to say, battle for those resources. So the same issues we've always been dogged with, really. The limits of the rules, that's obviously the key one. We have norms, but as we've talked about today, are they sufficient to allow cases? And yeah, as Daryl's just mentioned, it doesn't seem to be, unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be the right moment if we're looking at state political will in some areas of the world that previously maybe we could have relied upon a little bit more, like the US, like, you know, some countries in Europe, for example, to be pushing on some of these issues. There seems to be that quite scary looking transition period coming. Sorry.
I'm really happy to come back on both those things. Actually, I'm going to go back to your question, Jonathan, on the widespread, long-term and severe, because that was an interesting discussion within the panel, actually, because and as you know, that the additional protocol 1, but also the NMOD convention had two different specific recommendations in terms of, you know, kilometrage or time and so on. And I think that it was actually ultimately quite sensible in the end what the panel decided to do, which is take out those specific figures, because actually it was quite clear that there were examples of what the panel generally felt should be classified as ecocide. I mean, one example, for example, was the Bhopal incident in India, where the effects were absolutely intense, but if you'd have gone by the hundreds of square kilometers, would not have qualified, but everybody felt it should have qualified. So that and at the same time, there are other situations where potentially something could have been very widespread, but might not necessarily have been irreversible or long term. So I think the fact that the independent expert panel ended up with this halfway house of things had to be severe, because of course if you're going to make an international crime, something has to be pretty severe. But at the same time, making the other two sort of and or rather than having to have them both together was quite important. And actually, if my understanding is correct, I mean, criminal courts are actually quite used to dealing with that, i.e. the idea of, what is serious or what is severe or what is reasonable without particular numbers. And I mean, just to give a very basic example, if someone beats me up on the street, it's not the number of bruises that will tell the court whether it was an attempted murder or whether it was just a drunken assault, for example. It will be the overall context of what happened. And the same would, I mean, it's a bit of a basic example, but the same would in principle be true of different kinds of ecocide. And one in particular that I would bring up actually that was really interesting, when the panel first began, we actually conducted a kind of a public survey, a public consultation, the results of which were then given to the panel as initial considerations. And one of the elements of that was a small advisory group of indigenous spokespeople from all the different continents. And one of the really interesting things that emerged from that was that they actually never referred to nature at all. They referred to Mother Earth sometimes, but they didn't refer to nature. There was this sense that everything was completely interrelated in cultural practice, and there wasn't a separation. Of course, we've talked about this separation a few times today. And one of the results of that was a very specific word that ended up in the definition, which was cultural. So under severe, the sort of severe, the disruption or adverse harm to natural, cultural and economic resources, whereas the language that was taken from was from NMOD, which didn't include the cultural. The inclusion of the cultural allowed for addressing, for example, I mean, the example that springs to mind is that one in Australia where the mining company destroyed an Aboriginal sacred site, where the site itself was very specific, but the cultural heritage inherent there was extraordinarily powerful. And again, the panel sort of felt that something like that should be, come under the definition of ecocide. So you can kind of see how there were a number of different factors that emerged to mean that was the way that the severe, widespread, long-term was defined, and that I actually think, gives a certain leeway to the judges, but I think not an unreasonable one. And then coming back to the norms to your norms question, I mean, I actually think that one of the big factors here, particularly with the ecocide law discussion, is actually the word ecocide, because there's something about, the word, I mean, it comes from the Greek and Latin, and, etymologically it means to kill one's home. And there's something very apt about how that encapsulates what's sort of happening on our planet. And there's something that kind of captures the popular imagination about that. And, I mean, there are treaties that have been under discussion for some time at the UN. There's one, the name of which symptomatically I can't remember, but it goes something like, the effects of transnational corporations on human rights violations and damage to the environment. I can't remember the phrasing of it, but the very fact that I can't remember it is actually key here. The word ecocide actually has its own kind of almost internal momentum, that even when people haven't come across it, when you say it to them, they kind of get it. So there's something quite important, as a sort of expressive function that comes with that. But the other thing that I would bring in that hasn't been discussed today, but I do think is very important in terms of that norm creation, because when we're talking about norm creation, what we're talking about is actually changing behaviour, right? We're talking about having people do things differently so that we damage the environment less, and obviously ultimately ourselves, protect ourselves better into the future as well. And that aspect is the window for strategic change. Now, the window for strategic change, in terms of people embodying those norms and behaving differently, actually happens between when they hear about the law and when the law comes into place. So they don't kick in at adoption, they kick in now, or they kick in as soon as people hear about it, which is why the public conversation is so important. And it's also where Stop Ecocide International focuses on these two levels, on the diplomatic and political level, but also on the public narrative. Because, of course, we're actually finding over particularly the last sort of year or two, we're getting increasing sort of traction and important conversations with the corporate sector and with the finance sector, for example, who are, they obviously really want to know what is heading their way, effectively, what is actually on the horizon, the legal horizon. And there's no question that this is on the legal horizon. I mean, this is definitely a legal direction of travel that's been established here. And of course, what that does is it kind of creates, by default, a kind of compliance window. Because ultimately, we are not, if in that sort of classic stick and carrot analogy, we're not looking to use the stick very much. I don't think anyone wants to. Changing how safe we are on our planet doesn't depend on how many people are in prison. It's actually about how we behave. So ultimately, although of course prosecutions will ultimately take place, with a bit of luck, it won't take many of those to have the rest of the corporate world and political actors take it very seriously. And of course, the sooner they know about all of that, the sooner that starts to act immediately, to the extent that there are a number of reports already in existence in the sort of more in the economic sphere that are pointing out ECOCIDE law as something that boards of directors need to pay attention to, because it's something that's approaching in the future. So I think that's a really important aspect when we're looking at that norm creation. Thank you.
I think I will add another point of view regarding your question. For me, is this topic that you put in the table is more related to common law system and civil law system. So the independent expert panel was mixed between them, but at the end, international criminal law is more close to common law system than civil law system. So that's why when we discuss in the panel the definition of each term, severe, widespread, and long term, most of the lawyers or academics from common law system was very satisfied with the current definition of severe, widespread, and long term. But for me, as a member of civil law system, and my topic in my PhD in this university was principle of legality in international criminal law. So you can imagine that for me was like a nightmare or something like this. but my colleagues say me something like, Rodrigo, leave it to the judges. Leave it to the judges without problem. And for me is forbidden, because we must leave it to the legislators, not to the judges, because in our systems we don't trust in judges. Yeah, that's it. So at the end, that's why I in my presentation I tried to put on the table that probably we need to adapt the international definition in national legislation and develop in some way the terms of the definition of terms. So nothing is an impediment to develop the meaning of severe, widespread, and long term, and include what happened in the Protocol 1 or whatever other precision that we need in internal systems, but doing this, for me, the challenge is coherence, and I think with this word I will try to answer your question. What is the most challenges in the future regarding this conversation? And I think is coherence. Coherence between the international definition of the legal expert panel and what happened in the domestic legislation. Because I presented just in a few minutes some 5-6 points of the definition, but these topics works like like on-off. So you can put every single button in on, and the definition will be very wide. And yeah, but you can put every single button in the off, so the definition will be very restrictive, very restrictive. For example, if you say only action, not omission, only unlawful, nor wanton, severe, widespread, and long-term, only direct intent, and not endangerment crime, just crime defined by the consequences, you will have very restricted definition, as actually, as currently, is the Article 8 B2.4. A2B4. Yes? So this article has never been applied in practice. So every single country in the world can say, oh, I will endorse ECOCIDE, because it will not be applied in practice in the future. So we need to get balance. And this balance, the independent expert panel in the commentaries say, we already did the balance. We already did the balance. So we need to take care about the coherence, about what is the result of this wonderful, amazing process, because it could be a tricky if we approve a crime of ecocide, but very restrictive, will not serve, will not be useful to protect the environment, to protect our life in the planet, to protect the other species which share this world. Well, that's my last reflections.
Any of our online presenters or commentators who would like to come back? Marina, we lost you for a few seconds, but you're online. You're back online as a presenter. If you wanna come back with something your side.
Yes, can you hear me now with my phone?
Perfect.
Very good. Thanks. No, I just want to follow up on something and a thought that comment of Jojo triggered when she was referring to the cultural aspect. And it's just to contextualize a bit developments in other places, and I think has not been mentioned yet in this panel, which is that there have been developments connected to international criminal justice and the protection of the environment in the Colombian context. And it was precisely because of that cultural connection that this was possible. And I'm referring to the fact that in August 2023, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace in Colombia recognized a river as a victim of war. And that dovetails again with the question about victims, although it is more the river being the victim rather than the environmental agency that protects it. And this decision by the judges of that case was made possible precisely because there were Afro-Colombian communities that live in the basin of that river that pushed for the first recognition of a river as a war victim. And now it has taken a life of its own, and it's going to mean that there are going to be reparations for the river, some of which are going to be culturally driven, so about the community getting linking and syncing their life with the river that they have abandoned because it was thrown into mass grave. But it also means that there's going to be a process of thinking of reparations for the river on its own right. And that's going to mean that judges will have to systematically and thoroughly engage with scientists to understand what does the river want. And on the debate of the definitions of long-term, widespread, and severe, I've always been a bit puzzled with the definition of long-term as being, so I like to problematize a bit, if I may. Long-term meaning damage which is irreversible or which cannot be redressed through natural recovery within a reasonable period of time. First, I wonder what would the judges say about a reasonable period of time, because, for example, you was mentioning the incident where a person is beaten up, and then you can assess with your human prism what is a reasonable amount of time of recovery. Being a month will be reasonable, 3 years will not. But what is the time frame or the temporal scope of recovery that would apply to nature? And also that cannot be redressed through natural recovery. I find it a bit strange and probably makes a lot of sense. But for me, it would be like putting the burden on nature, as saying, so let's put again the person example. I think livers can be, like if you cut the liver, it can regenerate itself, right? So it's as if the criminal code say, it's very bad to harm somebody physically, but if it's only the liver, doesn't matter if it can regenerate itself. So I don't know if the comparison is understood, but like it's placing the burden that something wrong happens to the environment, but if the environment can deal with it, then it's not something that will fall under the definition of long term. Yeah, and that's all on my side.
Great, thanks Marina. Let's check, we're running pretty close to time, so let's maybe just check if there are any final comments from our presenters, expert commentators, anyone? Daryl, yeah, you got one? Yep. Let's go.
Sure, yeah, I could just, I realized there was a question from Marina earlier and didn't get answered. It was about animal rights and how that fits in. And it was a really interesting point she made about how the definition of widespread only talks about the harm to an entire species, and that is pretty high. I think animal rights would still get covered, and it would be done more likely through the terms severe and long term. So animal rights could get covered in that. And then it's another cool question that you just made about is it fair, this point about whether the environment will regenerate, but to stick with the assault analogy, it would be an aggravated factor. So common assault is if I just get punched in the face. Aggravated assault is if I get wounded in a way that I'm not going to recover from. So it's not unheard of to distinguish, to have elements of aggravation on that condition. So maybe it's okay, given that it's a disjunct environment, but that's just a thought.
Yeah, anyone else would like to come in with a final one? Marina, that was just a smiley, right? Not a hand. Yeah.
I'm just happy that someone engaged with animal rights. Yeah.
Good. Great. Well, let's move to the concluding parts then. Thanks again to our wonderful presenters and expert commentators. It's been a really fascinating time to hear your reflections and take on all these extremely fast-moving developments that have been occurring over just a few years, really. So I would love personally to hear Stop Ecocide campaigners like yourself reflections on what has made your advocacy campaign so effective. And that could be an interesting paper to share those lessons learned for other campaigns. And to me, really fascinating what several of the presenters have mentioned and commentators have mentioned about there being this common ground for ecocide, the ecocide norm building up, despite or perhaps in part due to so many other horrible things going on in the world for the time being. Sort of one more concrete point that kind of came, that I reflected on as we heard the conversation, is to what level we should view the ECOCIDE or the ICC amendment process and the policy paper process within the OTP as mutually enforcing, as I think you suggested, Giorgio, or to what extent could there be tensions between these two processes going forward? That would be really interesting to look at in future events also. There's a question about actors. So we talk about norms adoption, and in the conversations throughout the afternoon, it was brought at several times, the issue of corporate accountability was brought up, but it's obviously not an option as it stands within the ICC. Well, it's an option to prosecute corporate leaders, but not corporate entities, and more broadly this debate about what actors are those most deservable for being held to account when you talk serious environmental crimes. And in ECOCIDE, to my mind, that's a really important part of the debate that would be helpful to address moving forward. And obviously the challenge is, when you talk international criminal justice, that it has proven to normally be very difficult to go after the most powerful actors in the global order. So yeah, it would be really interesting to hear reflections on how these sort of challenges inbuilt in the structure of international justice can potentially be remedied in the context of environmental crimes prosecution. So again, to my mind, that would be a really important conversation going forward. So yeah, that's just some final reflections, and thanks again to all our presenters and commentators, and thanks again to the organizations and university bodies that have supported today's event. And thanks, of course, most of all to Stop Ecocide for co-hosting the event and for joining us here today, and for everything you have done to make the event today successful. So we're grateful from the university side. And yeah, you want to come in?
No, from my side, I want to say thank you very much for every single speaker, commentaries. And thank you for this wonderful university. Thank you, Jojo, for coming here. And I hope that we can organize again another event, our third event, because this is the second event. But if we take into account the May event organized by this university already, it could be the third event. So, well, I think it's very important for us to work with university, work with academics, with the students, the PhD researchers, and engage in this important conversation. As I say in this morning, we are living, I think, in a kind of civilization crisis or something like this, and we need many measures to prevent the worst scenario. We need to measures from politics, economics, scientifics, and so on. And from regarding law, we need a lot of initiatives, legal initiatives. But I am pretty sure that we need, of course, the crime of ecocide over there. As somebody said this morning, as a top of the pyramid, something like this. Yeah, because criminal law is the last reasonable resources to conduct, to deliver the society or prevent crimes or prevent damage to people and to nature. So I'm sure we need it. But we need more things, of course. As I say in this morning, it's not the panacea. It's not the panacea, but pretty sure that, of course, we need this crime over there in the Rome Statute at national level as well. And thank you very much again, Thomas, for your work during this month. A lot of months organizing this with Maite, and thank you, Maite, if you see this in the future, because we'll be recorded, and all our support in your difficult personal moment. Thank you very much.
Right, well, with that, thanks everyone for joining in the room online, and that's it for today. See you soon, hopefully.
Thank you.
Gracias. Adiós.
Adiós, Marina, encantado de verte.
Igualmente.